Hey, folks, you are tuning into Common Groundwater, a podcast by the Michigan Environmental Council, where we talk about issues of the environment felt across the state of Michigan. We go deep into the nuance, and then we try to pull out the stories, those local personal stories that can help us better understand not only the issue, but also the solutions to them. I'm Beau Brockett, your host, and I am pleased to be joined today with Tanya Cabala of the West Michigan Environmental Action Council. Tanya, welcome.
Well, hi there.
Thanks so much for joining us. You're playing a very special role in that you are introducing our new podcast mini series, a set of 4 episodes called Gears in the Sand, where we focus almost exclusively on the intersection between development or like human buildings and the conservation of dunes or the protection of dunes, and how both development and conservation have a relationship together, or sometimes a relationship at odds with one another. So thanks so much for being the person to kick things off with us. Really appreciate it.
I am honored and excited. Any chance I have to talk about dunes, I'll take it.
Yeah. And as we'll find out a bit later on in the podcast today, there's a reason why we're specifically focusing on dunes. Not only have there been a number of issues from a law standpoint and a development standpoint when it comes to these ecosystems, but there's also some solutions on the horizon that could be really helpful. But before we get into all that policy nuance, all that wackiness, I'd love to maybe just kind of ground us in a nice like little story from each of us. If you're a Michigander tuning in, chances are you probably have been to a dune, whether you realized it or not. And so, Tanya, I'm wondering, would you have like a nice little dune story that really means a lot to you that you'd like to share with us?
Well, I have a lot of dune stories, but I think my favorite is just recent. I was able to lead a hike in Muskegon State Park. And for people from all across the country many who had never even known that Michigan has dunes. And Muskegon State Park is amazing. It's one of my favorite parks. And as we were walking up a dune ridge and with this group of people, and you could look back and you could see glorious Lake Michigan,
Hmm.
beautiful beach, and then just kind of the low dune, 4 dunes. And then we took a turn and it was there, this huge low-lying area called interdunal wetlands,
Hmm.
just with wildlife and birds teeming with life. And then as we looked up, we could see this huge, tall barrier dune, and everybody just kind of gasped in awe. And I just felt so excited, and everybody was just thrilled to be there. So and I felt so lucky to live here.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I won't jump ahead too far, but I feel like that story speaks so much to some of what we're going to talk about in just a little bit here about all the features that dunes have as an ecosystem and the sort of like awe that they can bring to people. Um, my story to share is also one of awe, but in the literal sense of the word, of both wonder and a little bit of fear. Uh, the first time I realized I was truly like on a dune was only about like 6 or 7 years ago. And I've been here all my life. And I know I've been on dunes before, but when I first realized I was on a legitimate dune ecosystem was at Mountain Baldhead in Saugatuck. I went with my family. We climbed up dozens of stairs to get to the top of this very tall um, dune crest, and then like looked down and decided, well, let's walk down the dune to get to the water, to get to Lake Michigan. And so we went down to Lake Michigan, took off our shoes, went in the water, took a picture, and then we turned around again and realized, oh, we have to walk back up this dune to get back to our car and get back home. And at that point, the awe really set in. It's just to how large Mount Baldhead was and how brutal a climb it was to get back up without any stairs. Uh, we were sweating like crazy. Some of us were in tears by the end, but by the end, we all knew that like in the future we'd look back on that moment and kind of laugh about it. And so that memory of the dune has always stuck with me uh, all these years since. So. Uh, well, Tanya, you and I have talked over the phone once or twice, and you've told me more stories about dunes than the one you just shared today. And it's probably because not only are you a big fan of dunes, but I think the Environmental Council would argue, at least, that you're maybe one of our foremost dunes experts in the state, or when it comes to the knowledge of dunes and how they interact with people, development, things like that. Could you talk about your relationship with dunes from a more professional sense? What's your sort of career look like, and how has it looked over the years?
Yeah, and I think I'm probably a relative expert. There are not a lot of people in the state of Michigan who probably have spent so much time in different um, venues and in different places working on dunes that I have. But I don't have, I'm not a dune scientist. I'm not in the legal field. I don't even live on a dune. But I think the experiences I've had have been varied, and all kind of come together to put me up there as maybe a dunatic or a dunista. And I think it's interesting because I really didn't think a whole lot of dunes. I took them for granted. Certainly, I'd ride my bike. I'm 6 miles from the big lake. I would ride my bike out there and lay on the beach, and then have to ride back. But I would, run down a dune blowout or have picnics with my family. And it wasn't until I became involved in community environmental activism, and then started meeting people from around the Great Lakes. And they would be traveling here for meetings, and they're like, Tanya, I need to make sure to have a trip to the dunes. And I'm thinking, what are they talking about? What's the big deal? And so that was my first indication that, wow, there's more to it. And then when I was hired by the Lake Michigan Federation, it's now called the Alliance for the Great Lakes, but I opened an office in Muskegon. Eventually we had 5 staff there, and one of my first and main focuses was on sand dunes. There were a number of situations on the lakeshore where people were very concerned about mining in the dunes. Kind of stunning, I think, in some ways, to think that that the dunes, were just basically hauled away, for their sand, for primarily for use in the foundry, and that this was okay. This was okay under the law. So people up and down the lake shore started contacting me, because that was the area that I worked in. I helped to call for public hearings and comment on things. People alerted me about violations. And then eventually I wrote a publication about, all focused on the idea of mining in the dunes, how they were regulated, and how they were falling down in regulation. And actually, I feel quite pleased to say that we got then Governor Granholm to proclaim an official Sand Dune Day.
Mm.
Yeah,
Yeah. Which
yeah.
certainly is well warranted, considering, as I'm sure we'll discuss later, but just how globally special these dunes,
Yeah.
these freshwater dunes along West Michigan, of the Lower Peninsula and a bit in the Upper Peninsula are, and how critical they are for a lot of local economies too. That seems to fit perfectly. Totally warrants a
Well, and
SCS.
I think as part of that, we honored, people who had been sand dune protectors. So you learn about how there have been people up and down the lake shore who were, helping to preserve their local dunes, and people from a larger perspective, like Genevieve Gillette, who, started the State Michigan Parks Association and was very involved in the establishment of Sleeping Bear National Lakeshore. So, how exciting to find all these people who cared about the dunes enough to make a commitment to their protection. So, and then up and down the lakeshore, as I did my job, I would visit the dunes. If I was maybe stopping in to visit with a local newspaper editor, I would make time to go to the dunes in that area and to talk to people and find out more. So as I found out more, I found out about the names, all the Mount Baldies, the Rosy Mound, so called because wild roses grew on top. Maggie Thorpe and Creeping Joe, 2 twin dunes on either side of the Manistee River, not now gone. The reason that former state representative Denny Cawthorn, proposed a ban on mining. So dunes up and down the lakeshore, just what a cool place that I feel lucky to live in.
Yeah. What I especially love about all that story you just shared was that um, first, you really made clear that like there are a lot of people working on dunes or who do care about dunes. It's just in a very local setting, and that Dunes Day allowed those local
Yeah.
stories to be heard statewide, and that dunes are so beloved. These aren't just these sorts of woods that you might see passing by on a highway. Like people have names for these
Oh,
places.
yeah.
They have histories involved. I think that's really special.
Yeah, well, and I think too, as part of that, I started to realize how many dunes were gone as well,
Mm.
like Maggie Thorpe and Creeping Joe. Pigeon
Yeah.
Hill on this took the entire um, corner on the south side of the Muskegon Channel, called Pigeon Hill because of the passenger pigeons that roosted there, which were extinct by the turn of the century, and then Pigeon Hill was mined down to the ground by the 1960s, but I still once in a while at garage sales will find a Pigeon Hill picture painted by a local artist, a local amateur artist. So I have a collection of those. So
Wow.
yeah, yeah.
Very special. Uh, well, I feel like I'm chomping at the bit to get into talking about some of these sort of stories of the ways that humanity has interacted with dunes for better or for worse, the sort of the politics of it all, the history of it all. But first, I think it might be really good for this podcast series if we could maybe just establish kind of like what a dune is.
Yeah.
In your beginning story that you shared with us, I feel like you gave us a little hint, a little slice of what that's like, where it's more than just a hill of sorts, a hill of sand that we
Yeah.
might think. Could you explain a little bit like what a dune is?
Well, I think it's really important because I know one of the things I found when I began hosting, for example, news media who would come, to have a tour, and they're like, "This is a dune. We're in a forest," and I'm like, "Yes, there is, usually a part of the dune system is forested," and so I think a lot of this shows that we really don't know what a little bit more what a dune is, and it's not like a big hill of sand like out the Sahara dunes, and
Mm.
it's usually it's the beach. It's the fore dunes, which is where the dunes grow based on the wind and sand deposition. That's when you have little bushes and a little more vegetation. Often after that, you will have the interdunal wetland that I talked about, kind of a low-lying area. So a very different um, ecosystem, that wetland.
Mhm.
And then, over time, the big massive barrier, forested dunes. Now, granted, you don't always have them looking exactly the same way. They're often situated differently, but that's usually, how the dune system the different pieces of a dune system. But I always tell people, I say, the dunes to me are almost magical, like tall sentinels, that help to moderate, our weather here on the coastline. And, those low-lying areas are kind of secret places where special species live. And then we have the rare endangered, pitcher's thistle, and just the whole idea of how the dunes are grown, and how, for example, marram grass is in the dunes, and
Mm.
it's a plant that has to be buried in order for it to grow.
Mm.
So how cool that it's in the dunes, because that's what it is. But I just find them very magical, almost magical beings with their the different names that they have, and the role that they have played in people who've grown up on the lakeshore.
Yeah, yeah, I'd have to agree. Just hearing you again explain some of the names behind some of our dunes, what makes up a dune, it has a sort of, I don't want to say folktale, but maybe
Yeah.
folktale-esque
Oh yeah.
sort of approach to them, right? The way that they're formed and the way that like our own history is intermingled with it all. You, in addition to serving in various environmental oriented sorts of roles, also served on the city of Whitehall's council. And before we go on to our intermission for this podcast, where I'm hoping we can maybe pivot a little bit and talk about some of the political history of dunes and where it's led us to, I felt like you shared with me earlier a story about a dune sanctuary, which I feel like might kind of set up the second half of our podcast a bit. Could you talk about that dune sanctuary and some of the problems and solutions that arose from it?
Well, it's the White River Barrier Dune Sanctuary, and it's a relatively small dune area. But it's about 1,200 acres, and it's got it serves a fabulous function for wildlife and plants and vegetation, and it was bought by the township with trust fund funds, match. And I think that's another thing that I have marveled at how people up and down the lakeshore have decided to, acquire dunes in order to fully protect them. But they were not able to acquire an additional lot. And then there was also an easement left through the dune sanctuary that they had. And here and there was a threat of development in adjacent to the dune sanctuary with a driveway going right through the heart of the dune sanctuary, which really would, going through the heart of the dune sanctuary, would destroy it. And so the community actually rose up different times and testified and in front of the state environmental folks and things, and finally just decided after this one of the closer calls that they were going to take things in hand and purchase that additional lot and protect it. And so just a huge effort. I was involved with it, the Land Conservancy of West Michigan, our community foundation, our local governments and people, and raised I think over $900,000 to purchase that parcel and then eliminate the prospect of having a driveway through there. And I think one thing that really sparked our concern was the fact that the law had recently been changed that would make that driveway, which so far we had stopped, what I mean? It had not been permitted. It would make that driveway probably okayed by the state. So that recent change in the law. So I think that's what sparked our concern and the movement of the community to step up and say, okay, we're going to permanently protect this dune.
I think that story about the driveway really sticks out to me for two reasons. One, because it goes back to what you talked about earlier about a dune's ecosystem being more than just the sand. And when you put a driveway through, the wetlands, the forest, the sands that we probably know best and love, like that's all affected, and they're all interconnected and dependent on one another. And that story also stood out to me because too, even more selfishly, you set up the second part of our podcast very well with that, in mentioning that there has been some law changes in recent times that have really allowed for a bit more reckless sort of development to happen, whether that be mining or the more traditional sense of development that we might know, like building of subdivisions or marinas and the like. Tanya, after this intermission, I'd love to get into that with you.
Sure.
So for the folks listening, hang tight. You'll just hear a quick word from our sponsor, Calsec, and then we'll be back. The Common Groundwater podcast is brought to you by Calsec, an international company headquartered in Kalamazoo that provides expertly crafted ingredients that help food and beverages look better, taste better, and last longer, all naturally. Calsec has set aggressive goals to send zero waste to landfills by 2030 and to create net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. You can learn more at calsec.com. Welcome back, folks. Thanks for staying tuned through the intermission. I'm Beau Brockett, and you're listening to Common Groundwater, a podcast by the Michigan Environmental Council, and you're listening to the first episode of our mini series around the intersection of development and of dunes ecosystems. I'm here with Tanya Cabala of the West Michigan Environmental Action Council, and we left you at the break talking about some of the environmental features of Michigan's freshwater dunes. And we spent some time talking about the social sorts of relationships that we as humans can sometimes have with dunes. Tanya, at the end of the intermission, you talked about how some laws, despite our individual love for dunes, are maybe not so loving to dunes. That was not always the case. We used to have some good laws in place, but there's been some changes in recent years. Could you give us a bit of a picture of this larger systemic issue around dunes protections that Michigan is currently facing?
I think there was a time when some of the issues kind of came to a halt, and it was all related to this balance between the ability to live in the dunes versus the state's laws relating to protection and what's called like a takings. Gotcha. Which means that if you think that the government has taken all of the use of your property, then you go to court and you get money for it. But sometimes you go to court and they say, no, we're not taking all of your use, which is, so it's a little bit of a legalese there, but there were more concerns. And keep in mind too, that, the original act intended to have local governments administer the act. And most local governments don't have the ability to fend off an expensive takings claim, so more of the local governments were kind of giving up their administering the act. The state environmental agency was having to do that more, but then they were not happy having, these takings claims and going to court as well, so that's when there was a stakeholder group convened by the State Environmental Agency. It was the Department of Environmental Quality at the time. And interestingly, it didn't have a whole lot of environmentalists at first.
Oh, no.
Until some environmentalists kind of caught wind of it and popped up. We popped up our heads and like, what about us? And so we got included as well. And I think it was interesting to get a better perspective of the scene, what was going on, what the concerns were, and what the different interests were. We had the home builders group and realtors association, and certainly a different interest than environmentalists. And I think at the very least there was a better understanding of the two different sides. And the three different sides, you had the regulator in the middle.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we met, I believe, for 3 years. And at the time I was working for myself as a consultant. And so this was all volunteer on my end. And we were at many, many meetings in person. This is the in-person days when we went to Lansing. And eventually we came to a time where, and there were scientists as well, which I was really excited about. And one of the things that we pushed is, well, hey, if we're going to look at a different way of regulating development of the dunes, let's look at it from an ecological perspective, and so but we ended up splitting off the environmental folks and the scientists, and then the folks who were more interested in the property rights issues. And with the idea that we would come up with, this is one approach, and they would come up with one, and then maybe, we would see where we could agree. And there were some issues where we could agree. So we did that for a while, and then we came back. And certainly this is my view. Mm-hmm. And I was very disappointed because the folks who had the stronger interest in property rights just had no interest in learning about the approach that we had developed, which I thought was really more ecological than just regulating based on slope, which is like the main way that you regulate in the dunes, at least the primary way. And so most of us, I think, backed away from the effort, and there was maybe a little bit limited effort that continued, and then I just kind of forgot about things until 2012.
Mm. And then that's where I believe some of these interest groups that on the other side,
Yeah.
From where you kind of split off, kind of came in and made some changes or pushed through some changes, I should say.
Well, I was shocked to find that these groups had gone to the state legislature kind of in the late hours, late in the day, and said, "Hey, this is the consensus of this stakeholder group that I had been part of," and so they pushed forward their ideas, and they were not, and they pushed them forward as, hey, this is the consensus of the whole group, and the state legislature thought, oh, okay, these folks have met, and this is a good thing to do, and passed it. And in fact, they were not measures that we supported at all. And I was shocked. I was shocked that these groups would do that, and very disappointed in what happened, and certainly very concerned about the dunes going forward with the changes that they had proposed and that became law.
Could you talk a little bit about some of those changes to the law that were made, or some of the ways those laws have kind of played out in these 12 or so years since?
Well, certainly one thing is driveways would approvals for driveways would be streamlined. Okay, so that is one thing that kind of prompted concern on the for us here locally, the White River Barrier Dune Sanctuary. Also, development could happen closer to the lake and which would be some of the more fragile dunes. Also, there were limitations on who could call for a hearing. So for example, only people, I believe, like in the this is not precise, but in the neighborhood, or in that, let's say maybe in that jurisdiction, let's say if it was a township, could call for a public hearing. So even though I certainly would care about development on a dune on the lakeshore, I would not have the ability to call for a public hearing. And also, I believe that there was also one change was that if the local government or the state DEQ denied the permit, the burden of proof was on them to provide specifics in their denial versus, burden of proof on the developer or whoever wanted to build in the dunes that they were not damaging the dunes. So actually just putting a lot of work on the regulatory side.
And in these 12 years since, have you seen, and I think your story earlier maybe showcased this a bit, but it seems like we've seen these laws having an impact on dunes ecosystems across the state. Is that a fair assumption?
I would guess, but we don't have a management strategy. We don't regularly assess the health of the dune system. We have no way of measuring how well the law protects dunes in any way. So I would imagine that if driveway permitting is streamlined, if the burden of proof is on the local government or the state government to to justify denial, if these other changes are made, where you can build closer to the lake, I don't know why there would not be more damage to the fragile dunes.
This maybe leads into the next question that I have for you, which is kind of about what you'd like to see happen in the years ahead in regards to dunes. I want to give you a quick little shout out and maybe slightly an environmental council shout out too. Shortly after these law changes happened in the 2010s, you helped assemble at least the first of 3 different reports on dunes. We mapped out sort of the geological aspects of dunes. We kind of pulled out some of the economic benefits that dunes have on local communities, helping generate millions and millions of dollars for economies. And then we talked about some of like the social attitudes that people had around dunes and photograph changes that happened. And I know I throw a lot of information at you and at our audience here. I'll include links to those reports in the description of this podcast. All to say, though, that there's been some real efforts underway to kind of maybe one, prove to folks that dunes are really essential and they're really important and really fragile. And then two, to maybe set us up for some changes that we'd like to see happen. Long-winded way of saying, Tanya, what would you like to see changed, whether from a legislative perspective or from just a more larger social perspective when it comes to our treatment of dunes?
Well, and I've been involved in so many other things. I mean, one of the things MEC hired me to do was write a history of the act. I mean, what a fascinating story. And it's something we should all know. And to also look at other states and other countries, their approaches to coastal dune management. So I think that's when I saw that, wow, our dunes are truly world class. You know, if you take a look at the other dune systems, as far as some of the changes, I think I would like us to have a specific management strategy. How are we going to manage the fact that people like to live in these dunes? And of course, people can live in the dunes, but they are fragile. And, you know, as one scientist told me, you know, he was concerned that little by little, the dunes, as we have known them, are going to disappear. They're not going to be this fabulous, you know, ecological resource. So I think a management strategy, I'd like to see regular assessments made of the health of the systems. I would love to see public education. I mean, why are we not teaching about these dunes? Maybe we are, but in our school systems, you know, and I don't think we have a dune constituency, you know. So I think that's one reason why those 2012 changes to the law went so fast, because the people who care are the people who have a stronger interest in building what they want on the dunes, whereas we should have a larger base of people, whether you live on the West Michigan Lakeshore or not, who realize what a tremendous ecological and economic resource the dunes are to us. Our sense of place, you know, you travel up and down the lakeshore, and the dunes are part of our homes.
Yeah, thank you for that. I really appreciate that. As a communications person, I know that it's sometimes one thing to change laws, but you also have to change the minds of the societies those laws are in for them to work correctly, right? And so I like that multi-pronged approach where, yes, we need a management plan, but we also need education to help people understand just how valuable and how wonderful the resources right next door to them sometimes truly are. So, and I should mention too, to the folks in our audience, in addition to some of those reports that Tanya was so instrumental in creating, I'll also include a link in the description of this podcast that can help get you connected, if you're interested, into what hopefully will eventually become a sort of dunes constituency that you mentioned, Tanya. The Environmental Council is putting its feelers out there, I would say, to see who might be interested, whether it's an organization, a scientist, another person kind of intimately connected to the dunes, to see whether those folks might want to join up and join together and become a bit more of a connected sort of effort. So look for the link to that as well. I should also mention too that as I think I hinted at earlier on in the podcast, that we in Michigan are expecting to see some legislation formally introduced in the coming weeks. It may very well be introduced by the time this podcast airs, around dunes and bringing back some of those not only bringing back some of those original protections that we had in place, but also better being able to allow development to thrive alongside dunes and not run rampantly through them too. And that goes for not only commercial and residential developments, but also mining. So that'll be a topic of a later episode where we'll deep dive into that sort of stuff too. But know for the time being that is also on the horizon. Tanya, we're getting close to the end of our episode here. So one of my final parting questions for you, given that you've had such an extensive career with dunes in mind, and have had some highs, but also some pretty low lows when it comes to that work, what keeps you motivated? Are there any sorts of stories or philosophies that keep you in this fight, or maybe not fight, but in this effort?
Well, I think that the dunes are. I just feel so fortunate to live 6 miles from the dunes,
Yeah.
and to be able to visit them most of the time for free. And I feel like not only do we have rights, in our country, we have responsibilities. And I feel like I have a very strong sense of responsibility. And it's certainly not that I don't want to say no to people building in the dunes and things like that. It's just that um, too much of the time, when we talk about balancing dune protection and dune development, it's balanced toward development. And so
Mm-hmm.
I want to alter that balance by speaking on behalf of the dunes, because they can't speak.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I want to affect a better balance um, between that. And I also just feel that when you feel so fortunate, I'm reminded of Dr. Robin Kimmerer, author of Braiding Sweetgrass, who I've
Mm-hmm.
seen, and it was just just fantastic. And she talks about having a different relationship to the land, where you appreciate the gifts that the earth gives you, but then you also practice reciprocity, which is, so what do you do when you are given a gift? You thank the earth for the gift, but then you work to protect it as well.
Oh, that's wonderful. Wonderful. I think that's a great closer to our podcast. With that, Tanya, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much. Like I said at the beginning, anytime I get a chance to talk about dunes, I am honored, and I'm just enthusiastic. I love our dunes.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Yeah. And thanks to our audience too for listening through. Know that our second episode will be leaning a bit more onto the policy side of things. Uh, that'll be with Emily Smith, my coworker at the Environmental Council. And then thank you too to our sponsor, Kelsec, which is a B corporation, so very sustainably minded spice company based in Kalamazoo. Thank you for sponsoring this webinar and making not only this podcast, and for not only making the podcast possible, but also my organization's own advocacy efforts as well. So with that, folks, take care, and we'll see you on the next episode.